So what I'm going to try and do in this half-hour session is tell you something about how this particular young ecologist, photographed here in 1962, followed a career trajectory. And it's kind of interesting the directions that our careers take, which, looking forward through, you just cannot anticipate that as you look back over your career, there is some kind of logic to it. And of course there is also a series of things that happen that influence, I think, the outcomes, the success that your career has. I'm going to somehow weave a story without going into any depth of the science that I do through events that kind of parallel the ones that you can see on the screen here. I'll end up talking a little bit about primates, and that might surprise you for someone who is chair of RSPB, but there is a good reason for that. And you'll see, of course, that a range of other primates have kind of figured in this trajectory. I realised as I put this set of the photographs together on Saturday that I've had the same haircut ever since I was 4 years old. If I look back at my beginnings, it's interesting, they would not appear to be the beginnings that you would expect to lead to an ecological career. I was born in this particular house here. This was my bedroom window, and in the days that I lived there, it had a kind of sash window built into it that we could throw open and look out at the things that were happening outside. This is the town of Burnley, which in the 19th century was the biggest producer of cotton cloth anywhere on earth. So this extremely industrial town, and yet every morning as I sat in that room, every evening as I drifted off to sleep, I would hear rooks flying overhead on this kind of commute that they made every day. And it just so happened that my brother was an expert in birds. He owned this particular book, the I Spy Book of Birds. And we would look out of the window and he would tell me, and I would be 3 or 4 years old, the difference between male and female house sparrows, which were incredibly numerous in this northern town at that time. It was a source of inspiration, it was a source of something that showed me something of the natural world. And my father, who was an engineer, came from a generation of men who believed in the importance of going out into the hills, refreshing their lungs. So even though they had these industrial working careers, this was part of the generation that protested on Kinder Scout about the right to roam. This was a labour movement who believed in going outside. And he just so happened, he had an apprentice who was an extremely keen countryman, and he would take me out and show me, for example, salmon running up the river Ribble and through Yorkshire and Lancashire, and all kinds of other things that we saw on those outings. Curiously enough, I remember house sparrows very early on in my life. I remember rooks, I remember swallows, and one of the other first birds that I could ever identify was this thing called the dipper that somebody told me at that age lived along rivers, and it's a bird species that I've had more encounters with as my career has gone on. So my first big lesson in all the things I've got to say to you are about inspiration. Our lives are full of inspirational people who lead us in various ways. In this case, it was my brother and my father. I had a fabulous A-level biology teacher. I had a tutor during my first degree who one day stopped me in the campus and told me that I could be successful if I applied myself, which I hadn't up to that stage. I believed in myself. Inspiration is incredibly important. Being inspired, but also being inspirational. You know, we all need to encourage people to take an interest in the environment. Children need nature, and nature needs children, is the RSPB maxim. But you, as you go out and influence potential employers, are being inspirational about your subject. I just think it's so important. Because another major seminal lesson is that we all need learning, we all need appropriate experience. My degree was an ecology degree. I had atrocious A-levels, but I found a degree at Huddersfield Polytechnic that blended together ecology and social sciences. And in my third year as a professional training student, I went off to work from Huddersfield to this place, Box Hill on the North Downs, with the Field Studies Council at Juniper Hall Field Centre. And what astonished me was just a sheer variety of things that I could see on these North Downs choked grasslands. So, you know, I could go out and find 18 species of orchids within probably a 10 or 20 minute walk from the little cottage that I lived in just there. I was encountering people like John Sankey and Alistair Berry and John Beddington, people whose names that you won't necessarily know, but who were, again, major influences on what I learned about the natural world. And it just so happened also that at this time I was given the job on my professional training year of providing an identification guides to all of the aquatic invertebrates that occurred in all the freshwater teaching habitats that Juniper Hall Field Centre used. This was Headley Pond on Headley Heath. And so I had to start to teach myself various skills around the identification of invertebrates. This book by McCann became, for several years, one of the books that I thumbed through more often. 18, 19, 20-year-old boys thumb through all kinds of things, but here was my source of pleasure. Well, of course, one thing does lead to another, and I think an enormous amount of the way our careers develop are about taking opportunities, take the opportunities that come along, because one thing really does lead to another. From Huddersfield, I was lucky enough to get a first-class honours degree. I enrolled on a master's degree in applied hydrobiology, which took me down to South Wales, which at this time had some of the most polluted rivers anywhere on Earth. And that's why this particular applied hydrobiology degree course was running. It was set up and established by a man called Ron Edwards, who was a major influence on all kinds of political thinking in government about the environment. He was an important member of British Ecological Society. He was Deputy Chairman of Welsh Water. He was the Environment Agency and National Rivers Authority Board member for Wales. Extremely influential character. And from carrying out a master's degree that was about looking at river pollution and invertebrates, he gave me an opportunity to carry out a PhD, in particular around one watery theme, and this is a theme that still could come back. It hasn't gone away as yet. The idea is that, of course, the southeast of England is extremely short of water. In Wales we have lots of it, and this is a dam called Craiggoch Dam on the top of the Eland Valley system in the Wye, and the plan in the 1970s was to enlarge this dam so that we could perpetually send water down the Wye that could be taken from the Wye and put in the Severn, taken from the Severn and put in the Thames, and abstracted down here in London. That's a scheme that still might come back. And the job that I was given was essentially predicting what effects changing water chemistry would have on invertebrates and therefore other organisms in this, what was the first ever river site of special scientific interest anywhere in the United Kingdom. So I had to go out and survey hill streams. Again, I had to be able to identify invertebrates. I had to be able to model the relationships between organisms and their environment. But this was a sequence of events that went right back to some of those first skills that I was developing as a student working for the Field Studies Council. Well, it was around the same time that, in fact, I started to drive my PhD supervisor absolutely nuts, because I discovered that not only was I interested in aquatic invertebrates that lived in rivers, but so was this bird that I first met as a child, the dipper, which is just the most astonishingly beautifully adapted organism. If you were to ever go and look for a fine example of an organism shaped by its environment, this is it. One of only 5 species of passerines in the world can swim and dive. All the others are members of the same Cinclus genus. It has more contour feathers on its body than any other passerine. It has an enlarged preen gland. It has perfectly accommodating vision beneath the water and above it. It has more oxygen carrying capacity in its blood than any other passerine. It's the perfect size for exploiting organisms, benthic invertebrates, by swimming and diving. If it was as small as a wren, it would never have the strength to be able to do it. If it was as big as a buzzard, it wouldn't be able to get into the nooks and crannies where invertebrates live. And I started to wonder why it was that in some locations along the Wye River system there were far more dippers than others, and we started to put together, at this time with RSPB, various graphs showing that wherever food was most abundant, wherever invertebrates were most abundant, then so were dippers. And essentially that initial work, we produced a whole range of books and papers on this species, and that still continues today. So this is now 30 years later. We're still writing papers about this fabulous bird and its biology. And to me, one of the critical lessons is about doing what you love to do. My PhD was delayed by about 2 years because I was writing papers about dippers, the kind of thing that I guess your supervisors wouldn't let you do now. But my PhD was delayed, but my career as a consequence, you know, this is one of the things that I became known for, and still 30 years later we're carrying on this work. So you have to love what you do as well as doing what you love. Well, there was another story also, an unexpected story that came out of this, this work on the dipper. And at the same time as I was looking at invertebrates, while there were more invertebrates in some rivers than others, we realised that in fact that was a problem of acidity and low base status in a range of Welsh rivers that we worked out was a consequence of a combination of acid rain, acid deposition, and land use in various locations. And it just so happened that as we looked at the ecology of dippers, pretty much any aspect of their biology that we recorded was somehow related also to the acid-base status of the water. So they were laying fewer eggs along acidified streams, they were laying eggs with thinner shells, they had smaller broods, they were provisioning their young less often, the young fledged less successfully, survival rates were lower, interannual mortality was greater, time expenditure on feeding was so much greater, and everything was linked to the food that was available to birds, either because there wasn't enough calcium in the foods available to them along acid streams, or there simply wasn't enough of it to drive their energetic demand. And in fact, this was the first example anywhere in the world that birds were affected by acid rain. And this same evidence, this same information started, along with a range of other bits and pieces we were able to put together about the biological impacts of acid rain. All of that information started to influence the way policy played out, the way legislation played out, the way protocols for controlling emissions across Europe started to bite and started to have effect. And in fact, we've been remarkably successful at reducing atmospheric depositions, at least of acidifying gases, through power stations. And it all came from curiosity. It all came from wondering why dippers were scarcer in some places than others, why fish were scarcer in some places than others, why invertebrates were different in some rivers by comparison with others. I haven't said very much as yet about what my kind of area of scientific work's involved as a general principle. And in fact, as my first ever British Ecological Society conference in 1984 in Leicester, I saw a presentation by a man called Gene Likens, probably one of the greatest ecologists of the last 50 years. And Gene Likens' major contribution to ecology was to illustrate that the nature of any river catchment essentially influenced the character of the river that drained from it. And he showed by experimentally manipulating catchments, not this particular one on Hawaii, but other catchments in New Hampshire, he started to show that if you change land use, then you would change in some way the ecological signals in the rivers downstream. So the corollaries of all of that were that if you went and looked in rivers in temperate locations in upland Wales, they would be very different from continental rivers in northern Canada. This is the Athabasca River draining the Athabasca Glacier. The character of the catchment influenced the character of the river downstream. Well, I started to realise that same principle, following on from what had gone before, was exactly the same when you started to apply that same idea to the way that river catchments were managed. So this is the Upper Earvon, another tributary of the Wye in Wales. It's a special area of conservation, but it's draining probably one of the most modified locations in any rural landscape that you could find anywhere in the United Kingdom. So this is heavily sheep grazed, all of the semi-natural vegetation has been taken away. You can see conifer forestry, non-native species all around the catchment headwaters. It's been impacted by 150 years of acid rain. It's affected by climate change progressively. This is a really substantially modified landscape. What, of course, we need to be able to manage the resources that come from it is some kind of method of understanding those impacts. And an awful lot of my work essentially has revolved around using ecological methods essentially to look at the consequences of the way we manage, the way we change river catchments. And we've done it essentially conceiving of locations where we can do comparative, mensurative experiments between catchments that have similar character. We've experimentally manipulated whole river catchments in replica, and experiments that have now run for over 30 years, where we carried out things like forest clearance or calcium carbonate applications. And it's somewhere in this whole hierarchy we can choose to look at the consequences for river organisms. We can look at processes within and across river basins. We can look at how these systems change through time. And my work increasingly has become about long-term change with climate change effects and various other things, rather than comparisons in space. So that essentially is my approach. And another key part of it is to relate those trends, those changes, to organisms that live in rivers. So my bigger point about career trajectory is about developing a unique view. You will be specialists, you will be known for your unique perspective, your unique contribution. That's mine. Each of you, of course, will have your own. When you are playing as part of a team, you are in that team because of your unique specialist skills. Another key point in all of this also is about persistence. Career development is about persisting. And there are different ways you could look at the idea of persistence. We have now been able to look at long-term trends developing over 25, over 30 years in climate change, in acidification. My wife, Isabelle Devant, with whom I do a lot of this work, for Isabelle, the idea of persistence is something very different. It's about getting up more times than life knocks you down. So, you know, Isabelle has had 4 children. At each point, she's found her way back into her career. And I'm going to show you a large slice of her success that's come about her philosophy of keeping going, no matter what the highs are, no matter what the lows are, being persistent with the way that your career plays out. But the critical thing is about being involved, networking and being in the community. So from 1980s, late 1980s through to the kind of late 1990s, I was involved in a series of interdisciplinary projects looking at the Himalayan mountains. This is Manaslu, one of Nepal's 8,000 metre mountains. And we essentially gave ourselves the job of working out what the consequences were of changing semi-natural vegetation into agricultural land use across the Middle Hills and High Himalaya of Nepal. All of this work stemmed from a conversation at a conference that I had with some American colleagues, Jack Cosby, a Norwegian colleague, Dick Wright, around the importance of investigating this problem. It came as a concept, 10 years of work came from one conversation at one conference. And of course we've published a whole set of things, again, linking internationally across our network to write up this work, because you are here, you are already part of a community. The community that you form now, the networks that you form now, are the ones that follow you through your career. And I think a really critical part of that also is about being in societies that foster your community linkages. You know, the BES, I've been a member since the early part of the 1980s, and it's just one example of the organisations that foster networks and foster community interactions. So another key thing, I guess, and this is another example of the consequences of networking across organisations and disciplines, is about the size of the projects that you can build. I mentioned my wife and her notion of persistence. Isabel is now running a £3 million programme, essentially looking at the ecosystem services delivered by Upland Rivers. We're running this from Cardiff. This is a project involving at least 30 researchers, a whole range of organisations, different academic institutions, Forestry Commission, Environment Agency, Welsh Government, RSPB, Avonith Cymru, Countryside Council for Wales, a range of stakeholders that essentially comes as a consequence of networking and community interaction. But there's another point that I want to make with this very, very large project. You know, this is an enormous investment of resources and time and effort. We're looking at hundreds of locations in different ways, experimentally, through surveys, through long-term research. This is about looking at big processes around how things like leaf litter and bacteria and algae in streams are converted into invertebrate biomass, into fish and dippers, and what the consequences are for the regulation of water quality. I think we've got to be daring enough to dream big dreams about where our careers can go. We can carry out these large collaborative projects if we have a vision and a readiness to think at large scales about what we can do. Knowledge, of course, also doesn't exist for its own sake. I think that if I look back over my career, it's sat at the interface between basic science, between fundamental science, and applying that knowledge. You know, the ecosystem services idea that I was just talking about in that piece of project research is one that's had major resonance in terms of government policy. I sat in this room just around 18 months ago when Oliver Letwin from the Cabinet Office, Caroline Spellman, Secretary of State for the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, essentially launched this report showing us what the status of ecosystems in the United Kingdom was really like, what we were losing as a consequence of degraded ecosystems, and they told us how important this would be in influencing policy going forward, which it has been around the Natural Environment White Paper. I was one of the expert panel of 16 who steered this piece of research, and in fact I led the freshwater dimensions of it. It was about applying the knowledge that had come to me through my research career. I think another absolutely enormous lesson for ecologists, for people at your stage of your career, is about how the world needs you. So I was asked to say something about the job opportunities in this sector, in the ecological sector. Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management has about 5,000 members. It's likely that there are many more ecologists than that in Britain, perhaps upwards of 12,000. The RSPB, of whose council I chair, employs about 2,000 people, not all ecologists. We have 1.1 million members. We have 20,000 volunteers who give 1 million hours worth of effort. And all of that, those people in post, that degree of interest, is there because environments are hugely important. We could not live without the natural world. Of course, we're losing all kinds of things in the natural world. We're in an epoch where extinctions have never been faster, so climate change, habitat loss, overexploitation, pollution, invasive species are driving diversity and the resources that we need in entirely the wrong direction. There is, of course, a major set of economic and political contexts that make this a major challenge. World population is now in excess of 7 billion, rumbling on to 8 or 9 or 10 billion. There is a degree of material affluence and requirement for food and water and various other things that is driving the environment in a direction that risks being damaging not only for biodiversity, for all of us. And we live in a political context where actually finding leadership around the environment and ecology is extremely difficult. You know, we need our politicians to stand up and protect the resources that we are losing, that are critically important to us, getting our message over into a context where these other economic things, these economic imperatives are going on, is a major difficulty. Ecology, nature conservation is a global imperative. It's not something that only organisations like the RSPB do, it's something that we, as a corporate body, ecologists, do and influence. And the worse it gets, the better we have to be. You know, your generation of ecologists has to be far better and smarter at your job than mine has been, because the resources that we now risk losing are even more critically important. The stakes are higher. So which takes me to my last image of these two incredibly curious chimpanzees. I just adore this photograph. And it's one that came back to the RSPB just before Christmas. It was taken automatically by a camera trap in the RSPB's Gola Forest operation in Sierra Leone. I had no idea that we had 300 chimpanzees in Gola Forest. So this reserve that's set aside for bird diversity, of course, also is protecting the great apes. If we can't save the great apes, what can we save? But also this forest is delivering carbon sequestration. It's influencing global climate. It's combining biodiversity conservation for birds, for primates, with resources that we all depend upon. And that is where the ecologists of your generation will be placing large amounts of their work and effort. So my very last point, I think, if I were to look back over my career, and this is, I kind of borrowed this phrase from Aristotle, who said excellence isn't an action, it's a habit. And I didn't want to claim any kind of excellence, but I can tell you that a career is a habit, not an action. It's what you build day in, day out, from your stage, from even our experience as children, right the way through the conservative efforts of our career entirely. At which point I'll stop. Thank you very much.